If you're an entrepreneur and you're in the startup life, and some of these Stoicism has kind of popped up a lot, and I don't. I guess I'm trying to figure out why. Like I was in my, I've been vaguely aware. I've heard of this thing called Stoicism, but I haven't studied it. I don't know any really much about it. I'm not a philosophy guy, right? But I'm just wondering why it comes up in sort of that startup world. If it's just a matter of the fact that that's the kind of stuff that I listen to, and therefore it naturally pops up, or if it's something that really is just the sort of niche idea that founders naturally gravitate to.
Well, it's really useful, I think, is one of the key things. And we'll talk about how it's useful in a minute. So that's one. Number two is that, things do go in fads. And my hope is that this isn't something that just comes as a fad. I started to worry a couple of years ago that, Stoicism is the new yoga, where it just gets so hot and everyone thinks it's a big thing and everyone talks about being a yogi and all that stuff. So I'm a little worried about that, but still, in the wake of a yoga fad, people actually learn and practice yoga, and it's good for you. So it's not so bad at the end, even if it sort of fizzles out as a fad. Um, so the other reason why I think it's popular though is because of the people that I mentioned. They are influencers. I hate that word, but it's true that Ryan Holiday is an influencer within the tech and entrepreneurial community, and so is of course Tim Ferriss. And so those guys and others sort of in their orbit, have really bought into the ideas and have found them useful in their own lives, and then talk about them. So I think it's base utility, the influencer's influence within certain communities, and then the natural, preference of people for fads, for the new idea, the new thing.
Right. And it's funny that you bring up the yoga thing. It's a perfect analogy, because for me, like I got into yoga not because I believe in, the spiritual component of yoga. To me, I call it stretching. And I have a bad back, and the stretching helps my back. And I'm a very practical guy in that regard. So maybe we could talk about sort of with the Stoicism thing. I'd love to kind of explore a little bit the sort of the practical takeaways of terms of the I don't know, the practice or the thought around it. And then you could take it maybe a little further to perhaps past that a little bit. But
yeah, I mean, the core idea in Stoicism is pretty simple, and it's a practical life philosophy designed to help you live with less distress, with less pain and suffering. It's a lot like Buddhism in that way. I mean, in fact, it's a lot like Buddhism in a lot of ways, but the elimination of suffering is one of the key goals of Stoicism. And then in addition to that, it's to live as well as one possibly might. And how that's defined, it can be somewhat different for everybody. But I mean, to live as well as one might, and part of that, of course, is the elimination of suffering. So that's what it is. That's what it's about. It's not about. It's not really about even the teaching of philosophy. Epictetus would say, who was like one of the three main anchors that are still very popular within Stoicism, and he's my favorite. He said the teaching of philosophy is not designed to create professional philosophers. It's designed to create excellent people.
yeah, and then that's probably good for me to hear, because I mean, when I think philosophy, I think of old guys in a robe arguing about things that can't be proven, and in a certain extent don't really. It's like almost like a waste of time. Like, why are we arguing about this? Just get on about your day.
Yes.
Let's get into like Stoicism. So when I hear Stoicism, I think that the word alone sounds like stiff back, resilient against the feelings of others, and that kind of thing. Can you maybe let's start by attacking, or at least digging into some of the misconceptions around it first, perhaps.
Well, I think one of the major assumption that people have with it, and certainly almost seemed as the definition of it for a long time, was that it was one without emotion. You were strong, but you didn't give a shit, like you didn't care, and it's because you didn't care that you weren't affected by things external to you.
And that's exactly what I thought it was when you first brought it up.
Yeah, people think of it that way, and I think there's a part of it that's true. I mean, certainly Epictetus would say, so someone thinks badly of you. Okay, well, that's their business, So it's like, so in that way, that's true. That's absolutely true. That how they may think of you is really not within your control. It is really their thing only, and it's their business, and it's fine if they think poorly of you. So to be not tangled up in the emotions associated with how you might be perceived by others is part of Stoicism. And so if you extrapolate it too far, you get to this point where, you think that emotions altogether are sort of pointless. But Stoicism is not like that at all. Stoicism is not a passionless philosophy. Believes in the intertwining of rationality, which is like this core human trait, something that differentiates humans from all other life. And in the Stoics view, like it's like it's the same trait of God. This rationality is the same trait. It's like the divine spark. Anyway, I don't want to get too much in the theology part of it,
Yeah,
but
no, yeah.
it's there, and I don't think it's bad. And but I'll tell you one of the so people think of you as emotionless, and probably actually I don't. Maybe I'll save the most controversial idea in Stoicism, I think, until later. Just remind me to talk about it because it is, I think, interesting. But I think that the biggest misconception is that you don't care and you have utter detachment from the world.
And so that's not it.
It's not it. I mean, in Buddhism, there was most of Buddhism, the teaching of Buddhism from Buddha's perspective was about, was for the householder, was for the person who is practicing Buddhism, but still had to live in the world, who, is supposed to be a practical philosophy, just like Stoicism is. And so he talked to the householder, and the householder is somebody who has a wife, who has kids, who has land to tend to, to farm, who can't sit in a monastery or a cave and contemplate the meaning of life constantly. Not a priest. And Epictetus and the rest of the Stoics all were. It was very practical in that same line too. I mean, if you look at some of the, just from a historical context, some of the best known Stoics, the most probably popular one is Marcus Aurelius, who was, if there is an example of a philosopher king on earth, if there ever was one, it's him. I mean, he was the most powerful man on earth as emperor of Rome, and yet he was a Stoic, and he lived very modestly, and he was and was constantly trying to bring his own attention to his own development, to just striving to improve himself every day. And so he was living in the world. He had to live in the actual world, whether it be leading at the front wars that Rome was involved with. They were kind of holding back the hordes from the north, during his reign. To dealing with sort of the political infighting that would occur. I mean, this is a guy who, when he became emperor of Rome, the first thing he did is he shared his power equally with his stepbrother. I mean, it's like, sort of weird. It's a George Washington-esque sort of thing to do, to like walk away from power. But because he was guided by his pursuit of excellence and trying to live with virtue and control what he could.
Okay, so let's bring this down a bit to someone that you mentioned practical philosophy a little bit. So, like, what are the practical components of the Stoicism that you get that allows you to sort of use this in what we talk about on the podcast, which is like, strategies for business and things like that. You mentioned something earlier in your last answer that I keyed in on. It was that word, things you can control, for instance. That seems to be a pretty core tenet. Can you kind of maybe expand on that a little bit first?
Yeah, I mean, Epictetus had called this the correct use of impressions, and this was the sort of cornerstone of all of his teaching, was the correct use of impressions. And an impression essentially is anything that happens external to you or internal in your own thinking. It's something that sort of pops into your perception, whether it be that, you're driving and, you see someone crossing the road, and you have to react to it. So your perception of that person crossing the road creates in your head, an impression. And then you have, maybe when you get an email and it's some bad news about something, some bad news. Now you're qualifying that as bad news. So that's a non-Stoic thing to do, is to qualify it, first of all, as bad news. But the impression of it, the perception of this email that you get is the impression in his mind. Okay, it's the impression, and the key thing for him is to correctly use it. And the correct use of an impression is, first of all, recognizing what is in your control and what is not in your control. And if it is not in your control, it is inherently not bad. Nothing that is outside of your control can be bad, is one of the core tenets of it. So what it does, so all kinds of terrible things happen in the world. Terrible, and I'm using terrible because the Stoics wouldn't call it terrible, but these things are things that are objectively terrible. Like,
yes,
global pandemic is
that's
not
a terrible, right?
It's not good, certainly, but
right.
but it doesn't. So at some point we'd make a judgment about it, you know, and we can choose to either see things as something that is bad, as problematic, that is negative. Um, but it's not the most empowering use of it often. So like even with the global pandemic, so we have the situation where people are locked in their homes more or less for many weeks on end, and hopefully this will be ending soon, but it's getting, it's getting to people at this point, and it's understandable. It's understandable. But the global pandemic is outside of your control. In many cases, the orders of, losing your job is out of your control. Maybe a family member getting sick and being in the hospital is out of your control. So those things, in a Stoic's view, are not bad, though. They're not bad, and this goes to the theological part, which I could talk about that a little bit because it does matter, I guess, in this context. Those are not bad. The only things that can be good or bad are things that are within your control. So that impression that, a family member goes into the hospital or a family member dies, it's just someone dies. Is it bad that someone dies? And Epictetus would say it's not bad that someone dies. It's your response to it is what creates the good and badness. It's your judgment about the thing that happens that is where all goodness and all badness comes from. And so the correct use of that impression, I mean, all people die. Everyone dies. So if it is, and is in Epictetus's mind, it's the natural order of things. Like this is the cycle of life. How can death be bad?
Right. I mean, and we can kind of get into, I mean, this is life and death is a much broader conversation, but right. But like, death, you're right, as a thing that happens is natural and it's going to happen, but the manner of death can be bad. Is that something that we can argue on a little?
Well,
I mean,
say no,
there's different ways of dying.
He would say no only and I don't want to go too far down this particular road because I think people can get too hung up on it. So this talks to the most controversial Stoic idea there is, which is the idea of predestination. So in Epictetus and Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, all the big guys, okay, they believe that in predestination, which essentially is that there is a destiny. It's all laid out in advance. It is part of a natural order of things, and you could say part of God's plan. You could say, as most would say, Marcus Aurelius would say, it's nature. It's nature of which you are an appendage. You are part of that nature, and it is not. You can't disconnect sort of the future, or all of life essentially from yourself, and which is also a very Buddhist idea. So you can't separate these two. And so the natural order of what happens in life, to judge it as bad is incredibly arrogant of you. If you assume it's God, then you're saying you know more than God. Now, if you assume it's something more powerful than God, like a natural order that ties everything together, and you don't like something within that natural order that happens, perhaps it's because you lack some understanding about what's happening. Perhaps it's your point of view, your perspective on it is so small that you can't understand the good that comes from that. And so in the idea, there's like a paradox in Stoicism where it's the belief in predestination, where, these things happen to you in life, and you can't change them. You can't change them. And yet there's a sense of radical responsibility as well. So among the things that you can change, you are required to do so. Like you are supposed to be doing these things.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a paradox. That seems to almost make sense because there's so many things that you can't control. When you do recognize the things that you can, it just makes you more, I think you used the word responsible for doing your part to control that, it sounds like. And that's what I want to kind of get into, because that's how I first started to even pay more attention to the term Stoicism, is this idea that there's things that are in your control, there are things that are out of your control, and there's things that you can influence, right? Now, that's something that I've thought for a long time. I heard it from somewhere else. It wasn't attached to a label like Stoicism or anything like that. It just somehow it came into my thinking, and I'm like, yeah, I get that. So I guess I've been practicing that component for a while without having a label for it, right?
Well,
And
Stoicism is the ideas of Stoicism are so useful that they've been adopted by different religions and different cultures. I mean, a lot of the basic tenets in Christianity, which you know, had the Christians had some problems with the Romans, okay, and so there was some
Please
conflict.
tell me all about it as the Roman Catholic Italian over here. I'd hear more.
They adopted a lot of the Stoic ideas, though.
Yes,
A lot of the Stoic ideas got adopted, and even idioms now like "roll with the punches." That's a Stoic idea. That's just like it's like it happens. Like things happen to you, and you got to go with it. Like you got to go with it, and it's not. And I think that even the idea that like this common idea, well, that we look back on what happened and we go, you know, I'm happy that these things that I thought were bad happened to me at the time. At the time when they happened, I thought they were bad. But in retrospect, I'm glad they happened
because it
because they
made me
made
who I am
possible things.
now.
Exactly. And like that is fundamentally Stoic. That is fundamentally Stoic. And part of it is so we all do that in retrospect. So the trick in Stoicism is to do that in the moment. When bad stuff, bad quote, befalls you, it's to recognize that it's your ignorance is why you are perceiving it as bad. It cannot be bad. It cannot be bad if it's happening to you. And I understand that an initial impression could be that it feels bad and something like really unpleasant, but there are our own. If you've lived for any period of time, you have this experience of looking back on bad things that happened to you, and you could say that was the best thing that happened to me.
No, you're absolutely right. Oh, that's okay. So this is interesting because everyone can relate to that. I feel
Yep.
the part that I want to dig into more is that recognizing it as it happens part, right? Because that is much more difficult, obviously, right? You're sort of reacting at the moment and whatnot. So, like, what is the advantage of recognizing it in the moment, and then B, how do you get to that point? Like, is there like that sounds like where you get to the Stoic practice, Stoic training, all that kind of stuff. I'd love to understand a little bit more of that. So, because that's a lot harder to do. I mean, there's not a person here that can't be like, oh, I got fired and it was the best thing that led to this job, and now I'm here and I'm so much happier. And you can go into the Chinese thing when one door closes, another door opens, and I think that's actually I could be wrong. I think it's a Chinese saying, but anyway, stuff like that. So the recognizing it in the moment part that seems interesting.
So the way that Epictetus would go about it is, again, he would start with this basic premise of the whole point of Stoicism is to be able to correctly use impressions. So you have this thing that comes to you, it feels bad, you perceive it as bad, it seems self-evidently bad, and yet you have to ask yourself the question: is this bad? Is there something? What if this weren't bad? What would it mean? What if I imagined in a year from now, I look back on this as positive? What would that mean? If I could see it from the perspective might see it a year from now, how would I behave in this moment differently? And so it's a series of questions really where you almost use your rational brain essentially to take this emotional negative wave that's come your way, that's caused and you're responding to. And mostly what you're trying to do is you're trying to deny it. Most of the strain of the moment of like when something bad happens is the inability to accept it. We don't want it to happen. So we keep pushing it away, fighting it, almost trying to deny its existence. And that's what causes this great distress. And so being able to accept what is and go, well, this is my life now. This is my life now. And that there's there and if you have any sort of religious or faith beliefs at all, this is where it really comes helpful. It's like, well, it must be part of some bigger plan that I don't understand. And the Stoics were, they were religious, but not in the
Not
same
in the
way that
classic
you would
sense,
think of
right?
that. Yeah. They believed in there were in like some connecting tissue of the universe, in life, that there was something that tied it together. And Epictetus would call it Zeus, for lack of a better thing to call it.
Okay. Well, just bringing it back for a second though, like when those bad things happen, I think with the training, for lack of a better word, and that you can do, or that those who follow this practice do anyway, is to be maybe a little bit more attuned to how they're reacting to anything. So let me just give you a quick example. Like I don't classify myself as a Stoic or anything like that, but I have been working on, like, I've had anger issues in my past. And so what I've been trying to do is like recognize when I'm getting angry about something and not like letting myself follow that the anger part, but just being, okay, you're clearly angry, you take a step back and not indulge in that, I guess. That sounds like a version of what you're talking about. Isn't it? Anger is one reaction, but there could be others. It could be fear, there could be sadness, or et cetera, et cetera. So it sounds like what you're saying is that to recognize when you're getting to some sort of state of what I'll call agitation, for lack of a better word, to recognize that, and then try to approach it differently. Is that it's just a matter of doing that over and over and over again until it becomes habit.
I think it's actually useful for this to think about the practices in Buddhism, which there's so much overlap. It's incredible. And actually, when you think about that, these things sort of came into existence at roughly the same time in different parts of the world, it tells you something about truths, I guess. But in Buddhism, they think of meditation, and it's to be the observer. It's to separate yourself from your thoughts to the point that you can see the thoughts as they bubble up and pass through your mind. And then only the step in sort of controlling your thoughts or in choosing intentionally your thoughts is not control, but observation, to see, just to be able to see it happening. And so I always thought in my practice of meditation, for instance, that all it really did was it gave me a half a second between stimulus and response, a pause where I could see it, and so I could see the stimulus, and at first I wouldn't be able to do anything. I would still respond in the same way, and then eventually, I could start to, in that pause, in that slight space between the two things, I could start to choose a little differently. I could maybe take the edge off of it. I could dampen it a little bit. I could redirect it a little bit, and then ultimately get to this point where you can see it coming in. You can sort of anticipate even the effect it's going to have on you physically, and you can begin to force a non-response from yourself, at least in the short term. And the best way to do that is by asking yourself questions. And there are ways you can do this in advance, of course. And we can talk about one of the popular ideas that's made popular recently was this negative visualization.
Yeah, I definitely
We
want
can
to get
talk
into
about that.
that in a second.
It's like an advanced thing. But I think the most important thing is that, as Epictetus and Buddha would say, that you need to be trained to be the observer. You need to be monitoring constantly your own thoughts and responses, and seeing the way, how the programming is done, and then so you can intentionally program it differently.
So let me just lean into that just a tad. I get it. Like on one hand, I mean, when I talk about how I try to do that on the anger side, it's I'm trying to just be less unhappy, right? And that's always a good thing. But there's also a usefulness to letting that trigger you. There's a motivation, like as a writer, as someone who had a creative career. Um, some of the best stuff I've ever done has been in response to things like when I've just completely flown off the handle, right? And like, okay, now I'm pissed. I'm getting, what I mean? Like there's a positive motivating force behind letting yourself get into that space as well. Whereas total tranquility would be almost an inert state. So I'm
Yes.
sure you have an answer for this. So how do you balance those things?
Well, I don't think you have to balance. I think you have to be the master of your passions rather than the slave of your passions. And I mean, you can using those energies that drive you. Like there's certain things that just piss me off, and I find that they're usually things that are like if I use them right, they can be used for a lot of good. Because I'm the things that piss me off are usually things that are like some perceived injustice that I see. Where it's wrong, it's hurting somebody, and I get mad about it, and I don't want to be tranquil about that. But choosing the best way to use that energy that that seeing some injustice happen, using it in a way that is constructive rather than destructive, is my choice. I have, when I was younger, I was definitely a slave to it. Like I'd lose my temper. I mean, I, I was one of the many, many millions of teenage boys that punched holes in my wall at one point in my life. Like a lot have, not most, hopefully, but I know a lot have. And you are a slave to your passions at that point, and you're a slave. You are really not a human at that point, because there's really the rationality, the ability to be able to choose, is the thing that separates humans from all other forms of life.
No, yeah, and I was one of those guys as well. And there has been some broken furniture and electronics in my past as well. But I think I get what you're saying is that yes, you can let it motivate you, but you're motivated into that area of control. Okay, here, yeah, I could control throwing a remote against the wall, but what does that do? But I could also control it by writing something or finally taking the effort to, I don't know, organize certain components of like our business, for instance, that were messed up. And finally, I'm gonna get this done. You know what I mean? That kind
Right.
of, and then
Yep.
and it makes you feel better because you feel like you have to do something So at least
Right.
it brings. So maybe it's that bringing the motivation into the things that you can control, and somehow
Right.
that's always made me feel a little better
One
anyway.
one of the things that I like about that works for me better, one of the things that makes Stoicism work for me better personally than Buddhism is that it is so dominated by action. So much of Buddhism, you feel like you need to go and seclude yourself and isolate
Right.
yourself and go into contemplation. But Stoicism's fundamental anchoring idea is action. Like you must act properly in the world, and thinking properly, correct use of impressions, enables you to act excellently in the world. So, so using those emotions, using that fuel that you have, those passions, is part of it. And it's bridling a horse. It's so that it can be steered in the right direction, and that's that the practice is how you get there.
Interesting. Okay, that makes sense. And so, like, and now I want to get into the negative visualization part because, again, I'm looking at this through my own personal lens. What we started with talking about, which is that what are the things in your control, out of your control, and what you can influence. That's something I've long. That just seems like common sense. I don't know, you know what I mean? Like a
It
lot of
does.
philosophies tend to just be like, oh, well, duh, right? Now, this negative visualization part wasn't something I had thought about before, and I find it very, very interesting. So, explain what that means
Yeah.
and how you use it.
People don't like it because it's not nice, and you're supposed to have a good attitude, and you're supposed to think about positive things. It's rainbows and fairies and unicorns is like supposed to, what people are supposed to think about. But um, in the mind of a Stoic, it leaves thinking only about the positive, the things that you hope to be, leave you woefully unprepared for the things that could happen, and that in some cases are destined to happen, that must happen. And death is one of the most common ones. And of course, you have to realize that Stoicism came into existence, millennia ago. So it's not something that infant mortality was something that was very, very common there. So people would lose their children all the time. Now you imagine that now, and it's like how traumatizing. And I know a couple of
Oh
parents,
yeah,
unfortunately, who have lost a kid, and it's like it is. I just can't even imagine. I cannot imagine as a father. I can't imagine that happening. Although I have tried to imagine, that's the negative visualization part. I mean, I just like the depth of pain that someone must feel, but it was more common then. So people, it was really useful. This was particularly useful then.
you're qualifying something that you're about to say right now.
Okay, so essentially, Epictetus says, as you kiss your child goodnight, say to yourself, "You may be dead in the morning." So
The
his
child,
idea
not yourself.
is the child. Yes, the child may be dead in the morning. So you're thinking of trying
Literally
to
the
really
worst thing.
imagine that happens. You wake up and overnight that your daughter has passed. And what's the reason for that? Well, the reason for it is that it could happen. It really could happen. And when it does happen, you if it did happen, you'd be in a position to better respond in you as you should respond, as because there would be people who need you not to be broken by it. You would have maybe other kids or your spouse who will be suffering, and for you to be who you should be for them, you need to. This can't be totally blindsiding to you. So that's one reason.
You're training your impression, to use the word that you used earlier. It sounds like, is that
Yes.
the right way to put it?
Yeah, you're training the correct use of impressions. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's one. And number two is if you want to feel truly grateful for anything in life, imagine losing it. Imagine losing it. Imagine the worst possible thing happening to you. And one of the other things I say, one other part of this is that the things that we are afraid of, we avoid thinking about. So there's so imagine people who think about, well, what'll happen if I lose my job, or what'll happen if people discover that I'm not as smart as they think I am, or I have this fear of, because I grew up very poor. I have this fear of being poor. And I really do. And so I think about, it's not as distinct as it was, but it was something that was constantly motivating me, made me work more than I needed to try and get more money than I would ever need, and it was kind of dumb actually. But when I started thinking about it, what happens if you lose everything? If you imagine it to its furthest extent, every detail, all the way through, the shame that you would feel for telling people who knew you as being wealthy, now all of a sudden poor. for having to sleep on your, ask your parents if you can move your family into their basement. I mean, all of these things, if you think through them far enough, you take away the fear behind them, because you can imagine that, in that situation, obviously bad, but when I'm there, I'm still, it's okay. Everything is still okay when that happens. Like I still have the opportunity to try, to live well.
And well, it's more than that, though, isn't it? I mean, I don't want to dismiss that, because it does. This is something that I actually did uh, in the early stages of this whole pandemic thing. Is that I just happened to be sort of researching this idea at the same time where I was having my own anxiety spike about what might happen if this, that, or another thing. And so you start looking at, okay, if this, then what? And so on we've been discussing it on more of a sort of a mental preparation point of view, but it's also like an actual preparation point of view. You're actually creating a plan for the worst at the same time, are you not?
You are. You are. I mean, and depending upon the negative visualization in particular, the plan might require, like, if you're imagining, well, let's say we all get locked in our house for a couple of weeks. Well, let's have some food. So you go buy some food and you do practical things. When you're thinking, imagining your daughter dying as you're kissing her goodnight, in that situation, what's the real preparation that you can actually do? Well, really nothing, except for being grateful in that moment that she's here and treasuring the time that you have. And that does prepare you to not feel like, man, I wasted it. I was rude to her the last time I spoke to her. I mean, so it does prepare you to be able to, to justify, your existence to yourself, when negative things befall you. And again, it prepares you to better respond when it happens, even if you didn't physically do anything to respond, before that.
Okay,
You know what I'm
right.
saying?
So yeah, there's a little bit of both involved in this one, right? Like I always look at it on the more practical um, point of view, because that's what I did. Is I mean, I just had all these worries and things like that. I was able to take certain steps, and then and to your point, I was able to mentally like in my head, I'm like, okay, worst case scenario, we wind up doing this. Well, it's not that bad.
Could be worse. Yeah.
And that's kind of how I was thinking of it. Like, there's some people that are going to be in far worse situations, but I've got all these assets. Like I kind of it definitely calmed me down, because I have an anxiety thing, as you know. Like, I'm always kind of got that eye out, but I've also looked for steps I could take to mitigate the chances of those things happening. And then and for me, that's the motivating factor of the negative visualization more than anything else.
It does eliminate, or at least substantially reduce, the distress you feel in the moment about these vague fears, because we all have vague fears in our head, but they're unexplored, and we feel like it's dangerous to explore them fully, especially when they seem like they're something so utterly wrong, like the death of somebody you love, like a child. Especially, it just seems so deeply unjust and unfair that you don't want to contemplate it. And yet, by not keeping that fear vague and ambiguous, but instead exploring it deeply and imagining it, then you put yourself in a position to succeed, and or to thrive despite it. So, one personal example. So, let's see, it would have been in 2005. My little brother killed himself, and at the time, it was shocking and awful. I mean, truly. And one of the things, and I was studying Stoicism at the time. I had been for years before that,
Okay,
but it was really hard to, like, wrap your head around, because I had never imagined this. This was, I had never imagined this kind of a situation. And and you look at all the things that, how you handled it, what you could have done better, like that, because I was an asshole to him the last time I saw him. I really was. I was a jerk, and so I'm feeling all kinds of regret and guilt about that. Um, So I didn't. If I had more time to negatively visualize that, then I would not have been. I would not have treated him in the way that I treated him in the last instance I saw him, despite that we had some kind of underlying dispute that had been going on for a little while.
sure.
I wouldn't have handled it that way. I would not have handled it that way. So I wouldn't have lived with those regrets. But then once it happens, then and once you realize that you're in a bad situation, that something happened that's tragic and awful, and there's just no one doing it. The Stoics at that point, it's to fully realize where you're at, to recognize what the new reality is. And then, the way that I framed it, and Marcus Aurelius doesn't exactly say it like this, but it's to take something awful, take this terrible tragedy, and your obligation is to try to turn it into something beautiful, which is utterly impossible from awful things. But like that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to try to turn something ugly into something awful, some tragedy into something beautiful.
But that's okay. There's a lot there to kind of unpack, I guess. But let me just start with the end, which is that I don't know that you said it's impossible. It sounds like that's. I mean, most of the most beautiful things were created out of something terrible.
Some tragedy. It never. Well, it certainly didn't. Nothing makes up for it. I guess is what I'm saying. Like
Okay,
there's no the tragedy. There's nothing. I feel there's nothing that I could do that
that
could
could
in
fill
any
that
way
hole in any way. Of course
equalize
not.
the.
No,
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely not. But there are some, a lot of positive results come out of tragedy um, throughout the world. I mean, that's what I was kind of getting back in. I don't want to dismiss what you were just saying, but like that's what I was getting back to earlier when I was saying utilizing that negative reaction to things to motivate you into creating something else. Like some of the best art, for instance, has come from this areas of extreme pain and things like that. So,
Definitely.
yeah, it's
Definitely.
interesting.
So, like the Stoics believe the first thing, at least Epictetus, first thing is understanding your own thinking, understanding how you use impressions so that you can begin to categorize them as they're coming in. You can begin to see them as they're coming in and then understand what you're and label properly in your control and not in your control. So, like that's his first thing. And second to that is realizing that the only good and bad can be things that are within your control. That's so, and he feels like once you've kind of got that down, now you're able to sort of apply these things to the world, but before that it's very hard to sort of act in an excellent virtuous way in the world until you have some control or some grasp over your own mental processes and recognizing what you're how you're handling these inputs. You still of course have to act in the world, but you don't want to jump to the idea of acting virtuously in the world until you don't want to focus on that part as a Stoic until you first get your mind under control and you are start to understand what's good and what's bad. And then from there, it's acting the world. And within the world, there's lots of deep responsibility to act. So this is the thing that pulls people out of the contemplation part that's present in Buddhism into action in the real world. Is a sort of duties and obligations that one has.
All right, and I'm gonna get to that just 1 second. But the last question on the negative visualization part just comes down to this idea, like the constant, I guess, imagining of the worst case scenario sounds like a kind of a bleak way to go through life, and to a certain extent. So, is this something that you just do like a little bit, or is this like a constant thing that you do? Like, I'm really. I mean, I get it. Like at a certain point in the morning, be grateful for this, that, and the other thing, and then you go about your day. But it's like this idea that you're constantly thinking about what's the worst case scenario. It seems kind of dour a little bit, and I'm just trying to understand. But at the same time, I get what you're saying. It leads to you being more appreciative of things, but it sounds like a rough practice.
You're not you don't do it it's not like something you're doing constantly, but I think that the what it is when you an observation of your own mental processes, when you see your own thoughts and you see within your thoughts a response of fear, you know then that's the time to explore it further. So you see
Okay.
these things, you can start to see in yourself these things that you're afraid of, that you're avoiding, that you see like there's like there's almost like this black hole and down into your right that you don't want to look there. Like you could sort of sense these things in you, these fears or worries or whatever. And it's when it's in the observation of yourself, essentially, you start to notice these fears that you need to deeply explore them. It's not
Okay.
going through life and constantly imagining it, but it also, I find personally that thinking about like the only reliable way to invoke a true and sincere sense of gratitude in myself is to just imagine the frailty of the thing, you know imagine the transience of the thing, that it is so temporary, like that's where the beauty is in all things, and like
Yes.
within that, that's negative like that it will go away is what makes it beautiful.
It's so
It's what
funny
makes
that
life
again, this is the most I've ever talked about this stoicism stuff with you before, and what you just mentioned there, the impermanence of things, is that's something that I've held forever. It's from a whole different area. it's mono no aware in Japanese. It's a mujokan is another way of putting it, right? So like half of Japanese art and culture is all based around this impermanence concept, and it's something that I've always sort of followed, but I had no idea it was the same. It's funny how these things all kind of interconnect, I guess. So,
There are truths that seem universal.
all right, so I'm trying to put this into some kind of order here, right? So we talked a little bit about the control versus what you don't control. We talked a little bit about quite a bit about the negative visualization, and then you were starting to talk about sort of the responsibility to act, the duty. Uh,
Yeah.
these seem to be like pillars, if
Yeah.
I'm defining these
I think
properly.
that's one way to think about it. I mean,
Okay.
Epictetus, there are sort of these three main points these three main processes by which he thought of teaching his students.
Okay.
So, and he was the only, I talked about Seneca. I don't know. Well, I talked about Marcus Aurelius already. Seneca was an impressive man. I mean, he was one of the wealthiest people in Rome. He was a advisor to Nero, which it's sort of questionable. Like Nero was not exactly a great emperor. Um, certainly went evil in the end, and Seneca suffered for it too. So, but he's a man who was clearly acting in the world. He's not somebody who was living in a hovel, to like studying philosophy. Instead, it was a practice for him, and Epictetus was the one who was among the three who was the educator, and he lived very modestly, and lived to educate and the young people, and you know uh, the wealthy Roman families would send their youth to be away to be educated by him. So, in any case, so acting in the world is ultimately what you know. Because if you believe in this idea, Stoics do, that it's all connected, that we're all connected, and you're an appendage of the universe. Where everything is a tree, and you are a branch off of it, and that um, you exist for the purpose of the tree, not for, like, the branch is not for the branch is for the tree. And so with that comes certain obligations, and the question is, what are those obligations? And the obligations fundamentally center, and there's definitely debate about this, and some people don't like these ideas of obligations, but um, the obligations fundamentally center around the things that are outside of your control, that you're put in. So, like, whatever role, you are sometimes born into certain roles, whether you're born as a son. Okay, so as a son, how does one be a son well? You know, if you believe again that there's in predestination, you were put in that role for something. So do that role well. Do that role not for some end of the role, but to know that you've played the game well. I mean, one of the things Epictetus talks about is he talks about this idea of that, that the basically, I mean, he uses lots of, and so does Marcus Aurelius, sports analogies, essentially wrestling and things like that. But he's like, it's like you're in a game, and you're given the ball, and it's using the ball excellently in the game is what matters. The game itself doesn't matter, you know, and the end of the game absolutely doesn't matter. Like, the outcome of the game doesn't matter, but it's that ball handling. When the ball is tossed to you, it's what you do with it is what matters. And so there's lots of things that are out of our control, but when things end up when we end up in a situation, it's to accept it and to do with it what we might, to see what's possible.
Okay. So those are this is good. I mean, so in your control, out of your control, negative visualization, and then the duty to act when you have the ability to act, essentially, and then maybe even seek those. I don't know. Tell me if I'm wrong, but maybe seek areas where you could potentially act.
Yeah, I definitely, I think that's true. And yeah,
Are any of those the controversial one that you mentioned earlier?
no, actually, the controversial one I did mention was predestination,
The
because the
predestination. Okay.
predestination one is truly one where, like, it's everything that's supposed to happen is already known. Like, it's almost as if
Yeah,
you
I'm
are.
not sure I buy that, so I can see why that's controversial.
Well, I mean, a lot of people, when I tell them I believe that, they go, "Well, but you seem like," Gary's, the highest compliment I've ever gotten from anybody, I think, is from Gary, who said, "I have Gary something like he's never known anyone to have a sense of agency like I do. Where I feel like there's a problem I observe in the world, I assume, perhaps arrogantly, that it can be solved, and it can be improved, and I can improve it." and I have the obligation to try. So that sense, but that actually, that's, to me, that is not, that does not, there's not a paradox between that and the idea that it's all sort of figured out, because basically
Well, you're
the
saying
idea
that
is
you were
that
destined to solve that problem, not that the problem is destined to happen.
I was put there in that moment where that happened. I remember one time when I was in, and I thought about this for so long, but years ago I lived in Argentina, and I was sitting in this outdoor cafe at night, and as I walked in, there was a homeless guy who was sitting there, and he was asking for money, and he was obviously had mental illness of some kind. He was a little erratic or whatever. Went and I sat down, and then after a few, maybe 5 or 10 minutes of just sitting there, I hear what is unmistakably the sound of someone beating the shit out of someone else. If you've ever heard somebody beating somebody, it
You
has a
know what
very
that
distinct
sound
sound,
sounds like, yeah.
right? And so immediately I knew what it was. I had this feeling that that's what it was. And I could, I was out in this outdoor cafe, but there were a lot of people, and I couldn't see over to the sidewalk where he was, but I just had this strong impression that that's what it was. So I immediately went out there and tried to break it up. And, it was two guys basically attacking this homeless guy. And and I got in the middle, and I'm yelling at him, and my Spanish isn't very good, but I'm trying. And I remember looking around though, and the guy's like, he's like making these stabbing motions, like he's going to stab me. And I'm just like, mostly yelling, pushed a little bit and mostly yelled just to get him to, I was acting really aggressive to get him to walk away. And when we finally did, I look around, and there must have been 70 or 80 people standing, looking, and not any of them were intervening at all. At all. And that was definitely, I was outnumbered, but none of them were intervening. And I think that's because of some form of negative visualization. So I feel what I'm most afraid of in my life is being in a situation where I could act and I don't, where you could help, but you didn't, because you were too afraid or too ignorant or just not paying attention. So I'd thought about that. I thought about that a lot. And so as soon as when that happened, I was like, well, I'm supposed to do something, but is it smart to do something? I don't know. But I feel like if it's happening there in front of me, if it's there and I'm there, that I'm supposed to do something. And that's the Stoic view of predestination. And then what would have happened from that was what was supposed to happen from that.
Okay. That makes I guess I get that part of it. I'm still iffy. Though that this is a good place to bring up one other thing I'm iffy about that I know we're kind of going a bit long, but I don't really care. But so the predestination part I'm a little shaky on, and the other part was this. I've done a little reading on it, and I can't say that I'm an expert, and you've done so much more. So I'd love to hear your thought on this. Is this idea of somehow of not allowing yourself to enjoy certain indulgences in life as part of the Stoic thought or practice. Now, I get like the negative visualization, and at some point, people actually purposely will practice being in worse circumstances. They'll eat less. Like they'll, that part I get. Like, okay, what if I didn't have enough food? I'm gonna fast or eat less for this week or month or whatever it is to kind of train myself for that as a potential reality. That's not what I'm talking about. I get that part. I'm talking about like regularly. The idea of enjoying a fine meal is somehow anti-stoic or something like that. That's where I push back on. And if you maybe I got it wrong and you can explain it to me now, but I'd love, because this is the door slamming shut in my face on the Stoic side of things. Okay,
It's that idea is conventionally viewed as a something Stoics would have a problem with, like enjoying something like that. But I don't think that's true. I think what it is that a Stoic wouldn't ascribe as much value to it. So meaning that like it's what they would call a preferred indifferent. So a great meal is preferred, but it is not a determining factor of whether or not you are succeeding in life. It isn't. It should not affect my happiness. It should not affect my ability to live, which happiness fundamentally is happiness is found in living virtuously, and according to Stoic. So I don't need it in order to be happy, but it is preferred. It's a preferred indifferent is the way that they would actually categorize it. And there's a famous one of the famous things of that Epictetus says about life, and it has to do with food. His probably only one that I know of. He talks about eating at a banquet. He says life is like a banquet where you get passed a dish, and when you're passed the dish, you should take modestly of that dish, and then pass it along. And if one dish goes around you, that doesn't get past you, don't worry about it. And if there's one that isn't to you yet, don't
Don't
don't crave it.
bemoan that
Don't.
you never got that.
Yeah, exactly. And and basically, and his view is that that's true of a banquet, but it's also true of really everything else that happens in life. It's the same way with your family and with your spouse, with the roles that you find yourself in. It's like if just like in Buddhism, the thing that you're trying to get away from is something called dukkha. It's the wanting and craving, the picking and choosing. You know that a lot of our distress in life comes from this feeling that we need something in order to then be full, and then of course it never fills us. So it's this empty pursuit. But it does not mean that you don't enjoy things like that. Like, and
So
I'll
you can
say, like,
enjoy, if I could just interrupt, like you can enjoy them when they happen, but you shouldn't be reliant on them for your happiness, right? That's one way of looking at it. And the same
that's
thing,
the most important part.
right? And then on the other side of it, there's that idea is that yes, you want to be content with what you have, but doesn't mean you can't have goals to increase, whether it's to increase your life or to achieve a certain thing. You know what I'm saying? It's back to that you don't want to be in a state of stasis and say, okay, I'm happy with exactly where things are, and I never want to strive for anything else. You can still strive for things.
You have an
You have
obligation
an
to strive for
obligation,
things.
right.
Yeah, it's striving for excellence, if nothing else. And like, there's a lot of you can get into a lot of variance in how in describing that. But I mean, you have an obligation to strive, and just and my tendency is probably to be less aesthetically oriented. It's like food was absolutely not at all. But I grew up with like really bad food, right? Awful food that you don't want to eat. So I had
So did
no.
I. That's my whole point, though.
But so food wasn't something that I thought was important. Okay, I didn't think it was important, and it took for me actually because I think people are important. I naturally think people are important. I naturally don't think that other stuff is important. So, but it took me to really appreciate food or art or lots of other things to observe someone else enjoying it, when I could see that, I could then begin to really understand the why someone would enjoy it. But I really had to watch someone else do it. I had to see someone else. I had to like really try and put myself like to observe the joy and satisfaction it gets from somebody in order to really get a lot out of it. And art is a huge thing. I love art. I couldn't appreciate it first. And so I would go to museums and I'd watch people look at art. I would look at them looking at art, try to see if it triggered anything in them, and it helped me to better understand what, art helped me put my head in the right place for it.
That's
But
funny.
it's good to have it. You should pursue those things. And I mean, and one other thing this is kind of an odd idea, but it's not very well deeply expressed in most of the Stoic things that you read. But there's this idea of that in your life you are bartering for something, and that the meaning of life comes from that barter. I mean, like your life's energy gets traded for something, whether you know it or not. It's being traded for something, and and when you are actively trading your life for or bartering is what the term that would be used, your life for something, when you're actively consciously doing it, that's what gives life meaning. And so it could be as a parent to consciously you recognize the sacrifice and discomfort of it, but you consciously intentionally trade that your life's energy in order for them to be independent and thoughtful and kind and do something in the world. Like that's a bartering. If you're a craftsman, if you're an artist, like that the beauty in art is coming from people actually trading their life's energy. They're bartering it for something else to wrestle something into existence. That's where I think entrepreneurship is like artistry, because you're wrestling something, an idea into existence it wasn't there before you forcing it into existence. And it's a hard, and it's a trade. It has a cost. It's very expensive to you to do it. And that is where all the meaning comes from doing it. And so that's when people think of Stoics as not as emotionless in that way, but emotionless generally, but in that way, more than most others, I think they are They're definitely very emotional and very passionate about doing things because they recognize that the point of life is to trade the life for something that's meaningful. And it's much harder to direct your energy to actions that you know to be meaningful than to sort of fritter it away and not pay attention to it. So you could be a big cook. You could be a cook that enjoys and creating art and great food and sharing it with others. And that's a trade that's worth making. It really is.
That's I think a great place for us to stop today. I kind of wish we had had this conversation far earlier in the series of podcasts because I think it paints it colors everything that we talk about. I think going forward as well, and I think listening to this and listening to prior episodes, I think there'll be a lot more to take out of them as a result. So it's helpful that it really puts in the context sort of the point of view that you bring to all of this. And it's not everything, I'm sure, but like it's certainly quite a bit. It's
It's a
definitely
lot
the
of it.
canvas. It's the
Yeah.
canvas on what we're talking about here a little bit. So that's really helpful. And I guess expect more questions along these lines in future episodes when we talk about more specific topics. But anyway, thank you. It's been helpful. I'm not. I can't say that I'm a full convert yet. I want to take a close look at I got to take a look at the Epicurean side of things. That sounds a little bit more my, but I just don't know what it means other than the fact that it's got a lot something to do with food. So anyway,
Food.
but
Yeah.
anyway, thank you very much. This has been really helpful. More to come, I'm sure.
Awesome. Thank you, Anthony.
Right, bye.